Hi everyone, welcome back to Story of the World Chapter Highlights. I'm Sophie teacher and today we'll be talking about chapter 33 of your Story of the World 4 books. Now, both parts of our chapter today have an overarching theme. It's really talking about the division of countries, and two countries specifically. So the first one it will talk about is Vietnam, and the second one will be Korea, okay? So let's start with the Vietnam part at the start of our chapter today. So at the very start of our chapter, it was talking about everything that was going on in Vietnam. Now, last time we heard about Vietnam, the French were in Vietnam and they were ruling over Vietnam. So all of that area was French Indochina. So all that area was taken over by the French. Now, a lot of people, as we remember last time, there was a lot of people trying to fight back for freedom in Vietnam. We learned about lots of them last time, all the freedom fighters, but none of them had been very successful. This was until we meet this guy, Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh had many other names, okay? Maybe about 15 to 20 other names. But the one he's most known for is Ho Chi Minh, which means he who enlightens. Even in Vietnam now, they call him Uncle Ho, okay? So he's like their uncle still. He feels like, someone who helped their country so much. So Ho Chi Minh, had grown up in Vietnam, and he really hated what the French were doing to Vietnam. He hated seeing them there, taking away their culture and ruling over them. So after he'd grown up there a little bit, he decided to leave. And he thought, maybe, I can work to make Vietnam free from far away. So he ended up working on ships and doing lots of different jobs for around 21 years outside Vietnam. When he was outside Vietnam, he ended up making the Revolutionary Youth Organization, which was all about, getting young people into fighting for Vietnamese independence. Now, finally, after 21 years, he came back in 1941. Now, one of the main things about this was the time of World War II. Now, if you remember from all of our chapters on World War II, from 1939 to 1945, the French at that time were being attacked a lot by Germany. And, there was a lot of issues happening in France. So a lot of people kind of thought, maybe this is the time. Maybe this is the opportunity. And many people say this is a reason why Ho Chi Minh came back to Vietnam. He thought the French are going to be too busy trying to save their country. So at this point, he'd already made the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. So that was the party that Ho Chi Minh was the head of when he came back to Vietnam. Now, once he came back, he decided, together with the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, to make an army. And this army was called the Viet Minh. There was around 10,000 Vietnamese people who ended up joining this army to fight with Ho Chi Minh. Now, like I said, if you remember at this time, France was very occupied, and Japan was trying to take more control in East Asia. And that included coming into Vietnam. So Japan came into Vietnam and they decided to take control. They let French officers stay and, officials, but they had to be under Japanese rule. And this ended up creating kind of a war within Vietnam. War and famine happened throughout Vietnam, and thousands of Vietnamese people died. The Japanese also, a little bit later on, ended up putting an emperor in charge called Bao Di. Bao Di was what they called a puppet emperor because he didn't really have any power. He was completely, controlled by the Japanese. Bao Di was actually from the Nguyen family, who was a family who had long been leaders in Vietnam. So they were really using him as a puppet at this point. Bao Di actually only lasted 5 months on the throne at this point, because in August of 1945, Japan ended up surrendering in World War II. So, around a month later, September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese had left and the French weren't there anymore. The Japanese had slowly pushed them out over the years. So Ho Chi Minh was like, this is our moment to get freedom for Vietnam. And so he declared the country was free of Vietnam, and it was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And they thought it was finally free. Ho Chi Minh, had brought freedom to Vietnam. But unfortunately, it didn't take very long for the French to come back. After their country had been destroyed so much, they decided they would try and take bits back little by little. So in 1946, the French came back to Vietnam and insisted that they take back control in Vietnam because they were like, this is our country, we're going to take control. But the Vietnamese were ready this time. Ho Chi Minh was like, we're not going to take this anymore. So he knew they couldn't have an all-out battle with the French, but they did start a war between the two of them. And what really happened was Ho Chi Minh was in the north of Vietnam, and the French and Bao Di was brought back by the French, the emperor from before, were mainly in the south of Vietnam. Finally, after lots of fighting and lots of bloodshed in 1954, the French left Vietnam. But they had a rule. They were like, if we leave, you have to agree to partition Vietnam officially into two different states. So the top was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the south was the state of Vietnam, which had Bao Di as its emperor. Now, this meant there was officially a division of Vietnam, and this would cause later problems, including a war with the United States. Now, the second part of our chapter today, you guys hopefully know lots on this subject. So it's all about the Korean War this time. Now, as you know, around from 1910 to 1945, the Japanese occupied the whole peninsula of Korea. Korean people, they had their language taken away, they had a lot of culture taken away, and lots of them were killed during this time. Now, some key facts it's important to remember is that by the time it got to 1945 and the Japanese surrendered and left Korea, they had been in Korea for a very long time, and they had decimated a lot of things in Korea, which meant there wasn't really anyone to lead Korea anymore. There was a lot of infrastructure had been destroyed. There was, no one really trained to be the leader in Korea anymore when it finally got its independence. So the Soviet Union and the United States, who both had, been allies in World War II, said, okay, let's split the country up as a temporary solution, and we can help rebuild Korea, and then eventually put it all back together, and there will be, they'll have someone who's ready to be the leader. So that's what they did. So the North was taken by the Soviet Union, and the South was the United States. And they decided just to draw the line at the 38th parallel. That was the decision that was made by some American Army officers, okay? Now, this went on for years and years and years. And 3 years later, in 1948, it didn't seem like it was going to be temporary anymore. There was more and more issues between the US and the Soviet Union, and they started to realize they would never come to an agreement. So in the North, the Soviet Union decided to pick a leader, and they named the country the People's Republic of North Korea, and they picked someone who had fought for the Soviet Union called Kim Il-sung. Now, in the south of Korea, they called it the Republic of Korea. The US picked someone who had spent a lot of time in America, had got his degree there, and that was Lee Sung-man. Okay, so they decided on two different leaders for each part of the country. Now, a few years again passed, and by the time it got to 1950, North Korea decided to invade South Korea, and 90,000 North Korean soldiers entered across the 38th parallel. They had lots of, weaponry, lots of troops from Russia, and also Russian tanks. So North Korea and the Soviet soldiers managed to push all the way down to Busan at the bottom of South Korea. Now, at this point, General McCarthy, who was in charge of the US forces at that time, decided himself and the UN, which we've talked about before, needed to step in and help. They thought of this as like a spread of communism down from Soviet Union, and they didn't want that, okay? So they decided to step in. So it was the US and other allied countries from the UN, and they started to push the soldiers back. And they managed to push them back all the way almost up to China. Now, the problem with this was China then thought, we don't want the US that close to us. We don't want them that close to our door. So China decided to join the war on the side of the Russians and the side of the North Koreans. And around 200,000 Chinese soldiers entered the war, which made their numbers so much bigger than the South Korean and UN forces side. Eventually, as the fighting kept going on, it ended up really ending up almost exactly back at the 38th parallel. And at that point, they decided to split Korea officially in two. And on the 27th of July, 1953, they signed the Korean Armistice Agreement. And this was not a peace treaty. As you know, Korea still does not have a peace treaty, South Korea and North Korea. But it was just to say, okay, people can move across the border really quick. We can get to hospitals. We can get our troops. But, in this war, 3 million people had died. And like I said, there was still no peace treaty. And this was how Korea was separated into two different countries. Okay, well done, everyone. See you next time.